Early in the morning on the 23rd of December 1942, Hitler ordered Manstein to send the 6th Panzer Division to the west. The all-important airfields of Morozovsk and Tasinskaya were under threat, and these were the priority, as was protecting the flank of all the forces in the south. Group Hollet, or what was left of it, had fallen back to the main rail line in the Morozovsk region by nightfall on the 23rd of December. Badanov's 24th Tank Corps overran a place just north of Tasinskaya, and several flak guns were all that were standing in the way from the place where most of Fiebig's Ju-52s were stationed. Goering told Richthofen to hold Tasinskaya at all costs, which wasn't taken well by Richthofen or Fiebig. In an act of sheer desperation, Hitler ordered a battalion of his new Tiger tanks to plug the gap, which was clearly too little and too late, and this helps explain why he was pulling forces away from Manstein. Such was the crisis that Manstein even suggested withdrawing Army Groups A, B and Don from the Caucasus. Clearly this was the end of the Stalingrad relief effort, which had already failed by this point, yet some authors don't see it that way. The last chance to rescue the 6th Army, a breakout by this army codenamed Thunder, was categorically forbidden by Hitler on 23rd November. No, that's not what happened. It does appear though that Manstein still hoped he could hold onto the Mishkova River and then continue the relief effort at a later date. His Chief of Staff, Schultz, even told Paulus's Chief of Staff, Schmidt, that their intention was to hold onto the bridgeheads at the river, which they were currently struggling to do. In his memoirs, Raus even implies that he could have continued onwards had he not been asked to pull back. But this is nonsense. A mere glance at the map will show you that Raus's memoirs are completely out of touch with reality. He claimed he had way more panzers and Stugs than he actually had, and the other two panzer divisions in the 57th Panzer Corps only had between 19 and 36 panzers left at this point. So there was no chance of them going further. 6th Panzer Division's withdrawal merely confirmed that Winter Storm had already failed. At 1740 hours, Manstein spoke to Paulus via teleprinter, telling him that 57th Panzer Corps had been stopped. Do you think, if worst came to worst, that you could lay on Operation Donnerschlag? He asked Paulus to think about it and get back to him at 2100 hours. But Paulus said that the Soviets had at least 6 armoured brigades astride the breakout route and told him that it would take 6 days to prepare. Am I to take it that I am now authorised to initiate Operation Donnerschlag? Again, Paulus wants to start the breakout attempt, and he's asking for the full breakout. Yet, what did Manstein reply? I can't give you the full authority today, but I hope to get a decision tomorrow. Traditionally, thanks to Manstein's narrative, this has been blamed on Hitler refusing to give permission for the breakout. But Manstein knows he cannot get to Paulus, so there's no point issuing the breakout now. We're well past the deadline at this point. Even if he had told Paulus to launch it, 6 days brings us to the 29th of December, a time when Manstein would be even further away. So this narrative that Manstein painted later in his memoirs, saying he tried to coax Paulus into action, is not what happened at all. And at this point, only one of Paulus's divisions was classed as capable of offensive action, and that was the 29th Motorised Division. The rest were restricted to defensive operations only. The number of battalions in the army had risen over the past few days from 134 to 139. But that was only because Paulus was forced to form smaller and less mobile battalions in order to cover less intensive sectors of the front. His men had also been subsisting on 1,000 calories per day since the 8th of December, which was why they were physically weak. It's hardly any wonder then that on the 23rd of December, the German units inside the Red October factory were ordered to pull back. The 79th Infantry Division was so frail that it simply couldn't hold a front line that was this all over the place. Thus, overnight on the 23rd to the 24th, they fell back to the west. The Croatians were still in the northern parts of the Red October factory, and of course Chirikov claimed that his men retook the factory on the 24th, but that's not what happened. His men actually attacked empty positions, as the German accounts make clear. And for those of you who've watched the film Enemy at the Gates, it was also on this day that a 15 or 17-year-old Soviet spy, the sources vary, called Sasha Filipov was captured by the Germans and hanged. And yes, the film inaccurately portrays this event as well. On Christmas Eve 1942, after a brief artillery bombardment, the tanks of Baranov's 24th Tank Corps drove onto the airfield at Tatsinskaya. Fiebig was in the signals tower and watched as two transports blew up before his eyes. He gave the order to evacuate, and it was issued just in time. A tank shell struck the signals centre, destroying all means of communications. Artillery and tank gunfire wrecked several transport planes sitting on runways, but failed to prevent the others from taking off. Two Ju-52s collided in midfield and exploded. Others ripped off their wings and tails. Russian tanks appeared on the runways as 20, 30, 40, 50 and more planes skimmed low over them and climbed painfully into the murky sky. 27% of the operational aircraft at Tatsinskaya were lost. That's a total of 56 aircraft, or 10% of the entire Luftwaffe transport fleet. The amount of supplies that reached the 6th Army dropped to zero on this day, and a significant amount of stock and much needed Luftwaffe equipment were left abandoned at the airfield. Fiebig had escaped, physically unscathed, but despite having just been awarded the Oak Leaves on his Knight's Cross that very same day, these events caused him to fall into a depression. Pavlov's 25th Tank Corps was also near Morozovsk airfield at this point, and a huge battle now took place around Milerovo, where the Germans held on using Panzerschrecks and flak guns. Glantz even describes the battle here as a miniature Stalingrad. But here's something to consider. The Tatsinskaya event exposes a big problem with the airlift narrative, and Bergstrom in his book Black Cross Red Star explains this clearly. For an entire month, engine trouble, low serviceability due to a lack of spare parts, the risk of ice formation, and other reasons had been reported to explain to Reichsmarschall Goering and General Oberst Paulus why 200 Ju-52s could make no more than a couple of dozen sorties a day to Stalingrad. Now, with a cloud ceiling of just 100 meters and in thick ground fog and absolute impossible flying weather, all aircraft that could be saved from the disaster took off within 20 minutes. There are a few possible explanations for this. It can't be because the men weren't motivated to fly to Stalingrad and just wanted to save their own necks, because the pressure from Hitler and the High Command was too intense to allow that sort of slack. And while Fiebig knew the Soviets were on their way and so had prepared his aircraft to leave, that doesn't explain why those prepared aircraft weren't delivering supplies to Stalingrad. Surely it makes more sense to have the planes fly away from the airfield when tanks are near, so sending them to Stalingrad would have been the best option. There's only one explanation that fits. Why would planes be able to take off when needed, but not be used to regularly deliver goods to Stalingrad? It's because they didn't have any goods to deliver. Now, before we look at the evidence, think about it. This would also explain why Yezhenek's calculations were made, but then couldn't be achieved, or why Goering was adamant that the Luftwaffe could deliver the goods, but they didn't. Why the increase in transport planes committed to the airlift didn't really increase the amount of goods being delivered. Like, it just sort of hovers at about 100 tons. It also explains why, even when they were forced to fly from airfields further away, that didn't really impact the airlift significantly enough for this to appear on the charts. It also explains why they ended up delivering random goods they didn't need, like herbs and propaganda leaflets. They obviously didn't have enough ammunition, fuel or food to deliver, and so sent whatever they had spare. It does seem that the pilots didn't want to fly to Stalingrad empty-handed, which is why we also have reports and stats indicating that the transports arriving at Stalingrad weren't fully loaded. I mentioned this earlier in the series. So the issue may not actually be with the Luftwaffe, or at least not entirely. The issue might be the lack of supplies getting to the airfields in order to then be delivered to Stalingrad. And we have significant evidence that the German logistical effort was failing to the point that the 6th Army would have gone hungry even if they hadn't been surrounded. The 6th Army's quartermaster stated before the encirclement that there are food problems, plus other shortages, and that there would be a supply crisis very soon. And I've already given plenty of examples of this in previous episodes, but here are some updated facts. A report sent to Beria by the NKVD on the 30th of December explained that the Romanian and Italian prisoners that they had taken hadn't been fed by the Germans for at least 6 to 7 days, and in some cases up to 10 days, before being captured by the Soviets. Manstein admits in his memoirs that all the supplies for the Romanian 3rd, German 6th, 4th Panzer and Italian 8th armies came through the same town in Ukraine, a huge bottleneck, and that the Axis were at a severe logistical disadvantage compared to the Soviets due to this. The tank battle of Verkhney Kumsky, the thrust towards Stalingrad, everything is over. No day on which there wasn't any fighting. No water, little food. The entire village in flames, our own casualties rising by the hour, attack and counterattack again and again. Why was there no water and little food? These guys were outside the pocket. Could it be that their logistics were at breaking point? There is also the case of a Focke-Wulf 200, which was a huge aircraft capable of carrying something like 4 tons of supplies over much longer distances than the Ju-52s. This particular aircraft was stationed at Stalino, which was 300 kilometers from Stalingrad, further than any of the other airfields used for the airlift. Bergstrom says this was because it was close to the railheads, where large stocks of supplies could be brought forward. If the logistical problems weren't a factor, then you'd expect this aircraft to operate from airfields closer to Stalingrad, where it could potentially deliver 4 tons of supplies twice a day, rather than just once per day at the airfield further away. The fact that it was based further away and near the railheads, using up more precious fuel, suggests that there were supply problems in the rear. The Ju-52s couldn't operate further away than the closer airfields, so that's why they couldn't be pulled back to Stalino. Finally, we do have another airlift to compare it to, the Tunisian airlift, which was going on at the same time. Very similar numbers of aircraft, very similar distances to the airfields, and very different results. In November and December 1942, 320 total committed aircraft, not all from day one, had delivered 10,000 tons to Tunisia, plus 41,768 troops. Now, they weren't able to supply the forces they shipped over there, and they lost 120 aircraft in the same period, so it wasn't worth it. However, the point is that the Tunisian airlift operated way more efficiently than the one at Stalingrad. And there were only 2 real differences, the logistics and the weather. Western Europe had a much better transport network than the Eastern Front did. It was also closer from Berlin to Tunisia than it was from Berlin to Stalingrad, and even closer from the Ruhr to Tunisia than to Stalingrad. So this would explain why they could deliver so much more to Tunisia than they could to Paulus. But for those of you thinking it's the weather, you may be surprised to learn that the weather may have actually helped the Stalingrad airlift. The transports could use the bad weather to hide from the Soviet fighters, which they couldn't do against the Western Allied fighters. And sometimes when the weather cleared, the German transports didn't increase the number of flights. For example, on the 4th of January, it wasn't great flying weather, and 81 Ju-52s took off, and on the 5th, the skies cleared, and both sides therefore sent up more planes on the 5th, with the sole exception being the number of German transport aircraft. No Ju-52s took off at all, supposedly due to icing, which makes no sense at all. So we have examples where the weather didn't actually impact the airlift in the way you would think, suggesting that something else was going on. Maybe the issue here isn't entirely with the Luftwaffe, but with the logistics chain going to the airfields. We know that the German railways were struggling during the winter, so is it unthinkable that they couldn't deliver goods to the airfield at Tatinskaya, which was 2,000 kilometers from Berlin in a straight line? Now, you might ask, but if this was the case, then why did nobody say this was the issue in their memoirs or their diaries? Well, you can't blame Madman Hitler or Goering if it's not really the Luftwaffe's fault that the airlift failed. We know that Manstein, Raus and others were willing to lie, I've called them out several times now, so is it unreasonable to assume that foul play is going on here as well? As Sanders said before, the 6th Panzer Division wasn't receiving sufficient water, food or ammunition, and they were outside the pocket even though Manstein supposedly had thousands of trucks ready to deliver supplies to the 6th Army. It doesn't really sound like the generals were being honest, and it does sound like the logistics issues were impacting everyone, including the airlift. Also, we basically only have Richthofen's and Fiebig's diaries for the airlift, and they were the guys focusing on keeping it operational. It could just be the case that these individuals didn't consider the logistical situation or didn't think it was their problem, or they had just become so used to the problem that they didn't mention it, or didn't realise that this was the main issue. Their frustration with the high command might also be a reflection of this, even if they didn't state it directly. So I don't think that we can just rule out the logistical issues solely based on Richthofen's and Fiebig's diaries. The only counter to this might be, if the planes could take off but didn't because they didn't have enough supplies, then why didn't they just fly to Stalingrad without cargo just to pick up all the wounded lying at Potomnik? And again, I think this could be explained by not wanting to waste their limited fuel, also as a result of the logistics issues, and also not wanting to turn up empty-handed. I mean, how disappointing and embarrassing would that be? Also, the belief that it was the Luftwaffe that was failing, not the railways or the logistics problems before this, may have contributed to the problem because the German command concentrated on the wrong areas. They should have been looking at fixing the railway system, not the Luftwaffe. But obviously, this was something they couldn't do at this stage in the conflict. I think there is enough evidence to support this, and I think it's the most logical answer. But history lies in the heart of the debate, so what do you guys think? Can you think of any counter-arguments to this? Let me know below. At the Meshkova River, a brief artillery bombardment was followed by a Soviet attack. The Stalingrad front's Kotelnikovo offensive had begun. 1st and 13th Guards Rifle Corps struck across the river, followed by 92 tanks from 7th Tank Corps and the 220 tanks from 2nd Guards Mechanized Corps. Volsky's corps also helped out, which apparently brought the total number of Soviet tanks to 635, which might be too high a number, plus 149,000 men, versus 36 panzers and 15,500 men. Regardless of the exact numbers, the results were predictable. By the end of the day, the Germans had withdrawn back to the area south of Verkhney Kumsky, losing all the hard-won ground they had gained over the past couple of weeks in a heartbeat. Judging by the accounts, the Germans simply didn't have enough men or tanks to resist. The regiment now only has 22 operational tanks left. I am told that in total we have destroyed over 200 enemy tanks, but still they kept on coming. Obviously any talk of a breakout was now pointless, although the debate continued at the time. But this shows two things. One, that any breakout attempt could only have succeeded if it had been launched several days earlier than this, meaning that the debate over Manstein's order on the 19th is irrelevant anyway, because even if he had issued the order then, it would have been far too late at that point. But also, if Manstein's forces outside the pocket couldn't resist the Second Guards army, then how can we expect Paulus's weakened forces to smash through them? It's this fact that should condemn the breakout as impossible. Paulus never had a realistic chance of breaking out at this point or before, and that's why he didn't. Yet, at 5 PM on the 24th, with their forces falling back, Schulz told Schmidt to make a decision regarding the breakout. In fact, he lied, telling Schmidt that Tatsinskaya was still operational, which was false. He also implied that reinforcements were coming, and that 57th Panzer Corps was only on the defensive at this stage, not that it had fallen back. He may have done this to provide comfort to the 6th Army Command, which is somewhat understandable, but clearly it doesn't help the situation. It would have been a tragedy if Paulus had taken this information and had issued his own breakout at this point, so lying wasn't helping anyone. Manstein then asked the High Command once again to release 3rd Panzer Corps from Army Group A. Hitler didn't give him immediate approval, which makes sense because of the oil in the Caucasus remaining the priority. What's really awful though is that in his memoirs, Manstein said that the Soviet offensive towards Kotelnikovo, which really began on the 24th of December, only began on the 27th. This falsely led people to conclude that Manstein held the door open for Paulus for a week, but that Paulus had deliberately delayed taking action. This lie, on top of all the others, pinned the blame on Paulus and let Manstein off the hook. Inside the city of Stalingrad, some of the Soviet units that had previously been almost wiped out were now withdrawn to be reconstituted. These were Sologub's, Smekadvorov's and Zolodev's divisions. The commanders went to see Chuikov, who got emotional, saying goodbye to these men, all of whom had held on with him in the darkest hours of the fighting. For the Germans, conditions in the pocket were mixed. The men tried to make the best of what they had on Christmas Eve, and Hull notes that the fighting troops in his regiment received a full loaf of bread on this day, plus some horsemeat sausage, 10 cigarettes, and some punch. 297th Infantry Division also slaughtered a horse for sausage, and the troops made Christmas trees from branches and wooden crates. Others even made a Christmas tree from grass. But even though they made the best of it, morale was clearly suffering. Colonel Adams says that many just wanted to be alone with their thoughts, and there is evidence that some of the men contemplated shooting themselves. Then Christmas Day arrived, and all through the fatherland, people tuned in their radios to hear German soldiers from many different fronts sing Silent Night. Supposedly, the men of Stalingrad joined in with the singing, and you can find the broadcast online. I won't play it here because of YouTube's broken copyright system. At the very least, the Stalingrad part of this singing is fake, if not the whole thing. Some of the soldiers in Stalingrad listened to the broadcast and cried, upset by the false impression this was giving of their situation. But the men gave each other presents. One officer gave away everything he had to his men. Wine and other spirits were poured, chocolate was devoured, and in one case some donuts were baked. Extra rations were handed out as a Christmas present, and each soldier got a full loaf of bread plus extra tinned rations. There was even a roast dinner provided for the men of the 76th Infantry Division. Yet no supplies reached the pocket, and 1,280 German soldiers died at Stalingrad on Christmas Day 1942, 43 from frostbite, as the temperature plunged to minus 25 degrees. So, for them at least, it was a silent night. And I want to take this opportunity to point out that a lot of the books are sympathetic to the plight of the 6th Army. It's not good to see people suffer, and starvation is obviously a terrible thing to go through. However, we must remember that many of the men fighting at Stalingrad were criminals of the lowest order. They had pillaged and arred their way across the Eastern Front. They had lived off the land, stealing the food, clothing and lives off the peasants, and shipped thousands of civilians to the slave labour camps of the Reich. I know there will be people saying that the 6th Army was innocent, but we have evidence of Hitler ordering the 6th Army to destroy his previous order regarding the murder of sabotage groups. We also know that Walter von Reichenau, the previous commander of the 6th Army, had issued the Severity Order in October 1941, which targeted Jews. This order was circulated to all the army commanders in the East. He was also praised for sending his troops to cooperate with Otto Rausch's Einsatzgruppen C. So, the 6th Army wasn't at all innocent. As the German troops were going hungry at Stalingrad, their Russian prisoners at Gumrak and Voropanovo were currently eating each other, as they had only received some rotten corn from the Stalingrad grain elevator. Stalingrad's civilian population had been sent to the camps, and many had already perished, something we'll discuss at the end of the series. When the Soviets liberated Kotelnikovo in a few days' time, the civilians told them of 300 girls and boys being sent off to Germany as slaves. They also said there had been a lot of R-ing. Admittedly, this may have been 4th Panzer Army rather than 6th Army, but some of the units in the pocket were from the 4th Panzer Army, so when we hear about the terrible conditions the troops in the pocket were facing, we must remind ourselves not to be too sympathetic to their plight. South of Stalingrad, the Soviets advanced, with 2nd Guards Army reaching the Aksai River, and 51st Army racing even further south. Apparently, it was only at this moment that the Germans confirmed that 2nd Guards Army was the one attacking them, and if this is the case, then it shows just how outmatched the Germans were at this time. On the 25th of December, it was all over. We are hopelessly outnumbered and in many respects technically inferior. Superior leadership, morale and training alone is not sufficient without ammunition, fuel, food, water and spare parts. The Russians are wearing us down. The infantry here is already broken, and the sole appearance of a Russian armoured car is enough to cause entire picket lines of tired, exhausted Lancers to fall back. Sander was wounded the next day and ended up being sent to the rear. Manstein also sent a message to Hitler detailing the situation, confirming that the relief operation was dead and insisting that Army Group A be withdrawn from the Caucasus. Hitler wasn't impressed, and his relationship with Manstein soured. Once again, on the 26th, no supplies reached the 6th Army until the late evening, causing Paulus to complain to Manstein, saying, "It is the best flying weather here, but still no planes." He said the army would collapse if they didn't get more supplies plus 250 men per day as replacements. And in the afternoon, he still spoke about Donauschlag, saying it wouldn't be feasible unless a corridor was established by the outside forces, indicating that the 6th Army had no idea what was going on outside the pocket. The bread ration was reduced to 2 ounces per day on the 26th of December. They were given less than a quart of vegetable soup at midday, and either tinned food or a second bowl of soup in the evening. There was no fat left because stores had already run out. Another source suggests that the rations were 200 grams, 7 ounces of bread, by late December, with 200 grams of horse meat, 30 grams of fat, and 3 cigarettes per day. So maybe local stores were doing better than the official ones. For comparison's sake, the inhabitants of Leningrad during the frightful siege in the winter of 1941-42 subsisted on daily rations ranging from 7 to 12.2 ounces for workers and their dependents, while soldiers defending the city received 17.6 ounces of bread. They calculated that their remaining horses would provide them with meat until the 15th of January, so time was running out. General Yenica therefore presented his plans for the breakout operation, which now included some of his forces as well, indicating that Paulus was still serious about the breakout. The problem was that the relief forces were now busy retreating towards Kotelnikovo, trying to escape the Soviet juggernaut. The collapsing Romanian units on their west flank were now reduced to the strength of just 1 battalion, and the Popescu cavalry group was effectively wiped out by this point. The only things slowing the 2nd Guards Army down were a flak regiment deployed with 17th Panzer Division and the lack of fuel brought on because they had outstretched their logistics. Otherwise, the advance was going smoothly, and a breakout was simply off the cards. Further west, the 11th Panzer Division had reached Tasinskaya and started battling the 24th Tank Corps. 6th Panzer Division moved into the region between the 24th and 25th Tank Corps, keeping them separated, and then attacked them. So the Germans were trying their best to get the airlift back in operation. Aircraft were now operating from Salsk in the northern Caucasus, which was 200 miles, 325 kilometers from Stalingrad. This lengthy distance meant that the transports had to carry additional fuel, which meant less supplies could be delivered per aircraft, even though this doesn't seem to have impacted the numbers delivered. That evening, Generals Schultz and Schmidt spoke again, with this conversation being somewhat more honest than the last. Schultz admitted that the 57th Panzer Corps had lost the Aksai River line and was withdrawing to the Kotelnikovo region. He said that reinforcements would come and that they would attack again in about 10 days' time, which was wishful thinking. He admitted that Tasinskaya had been lost and that General Richthofen was gathering another 270 aircraft to help him with the airlift, then explained that they thought about nothing else other than trying to maintain 6th Army's airlift and relief efforts. Manstein was trying to get permission for Army Group A to be transferred to his control so that they could launch an attack towards Stalingrad, but none of this was taken well by Schmidt. We are gradually turning bitter, living on unfulfilled promises from Army Group headquarters. On the 27th of December 1942, Hitler announced that reinforcements would be sent from the Western Front, plus 1 division from Army Group Centre, to rescue the 6th Army. These were mostly SS divisions, and as Glantz and Manstein correctly point out, this was absurd because they would never arrive in time. Their impact would only be felt in mid-February, which was far too late for the 6th Army. The Soviet advance continued in all areas, with their tanks reaching the Kotelnikovo area and starting to fight for the town itself. The Romanians were also collapsing to the east in the face of 2 admittedly weak Soviet tank formations, with the 4th Romanian Division now wiped out completely. In fact, the entire Romanian force in this sector consisted of just 2 infantry battalions, 3 battalions of artillery, 2 cavalry squadrons, and 2 horse artillery batteries, which is why they were subsequently withdrawn from the fighting in the next few days. To the west, 5th Tank Army launched its own offensive, the Termosin Offensive, against German forces west of Oblivskaya, and actually managed to push some of its forces close to Chernyshkovsky. This attack would soon develop some momentum in the next few days, and as this was happening, General Voronov submitted his plans for Operation Ring, the annihilation of the 6th Army. An overwhelming force of 14 rifle divisions, 8 tank regiments and a ton of other artillery units would smash through the western defences of the Stalingrad pocket before pushing through to Stalingrad city itself. Voronov estimated that the whole thing would take about 8 days from start to finish, which was optimistic to say the least, because the Soviets still didn't know how many Germans they had trapped in the pocket, and underestimated the resistance they would face. Finally, on the 28th of December, the 11th Panzer Division managed to recapture Tatsinskaya. But with Soviet lines so close to these airfields, the transports couldn't operate from them. Goering had transferred aircraft from the Tunisian airlift, and these had begun to arrive, so 307 transports were now available. This number would climb to 516 by New Year's Day. But as I said, this vast increase in transport capacity isn't visible in the tons delivered, again suggesting that the issue wasn't the number of planes. A desperate Paulus sent General Huber out of the pocket to speak with Hitler, armed with a document detailing the dire state of his army. Paulus had lost 33,100 men since the 21st of November and had no choice but to fill the combat roles with non-combat soldiers. Huber received a medal and was so impressed by Hitler's charisma that he was won over by the promise that the Sixth Army would be rescued. But this promise rang empty as the Soviets launched yet another offensive, this time against the Germans at the Cher. Not only were 5th Tank and 5th Shock Armies already striking Meit's core, but elements of 2nd Guards Army now crossed the Don in the south, threatening to outflank the entire area. At first, Meit was able to hold on, although he was struggling, but he had no answer for the southern crossing, nor what was happening to his west, and it was blatantly obvious that Meit's corps, the closest forces now to Paulus, weren't going to hold on much longer. South of Stalingrad, Rotomistrov's 7th Tank Corps battled to take Kotelnikovo, while the other forces advanced as well. Manstein had ordered the SS Viking Division to move from the Caucasus to this area, but this still hadn't arrived. He could do this because the German High Command had finally issued an order that Army Group A would be subordinate to Army Group Don, effectively beginning the process of withdrawing Army Group A from the Caucasus. This was largely due to Zeitzler effectively begging Hitler. However, it was far too late to save the 6th Army, which now had a new task. The formation of a new defensive position in the southern sector depends upon our holding on. I am responsible if Army Group A suffers the same fate as us. In effect, although he did not admit it publicly, by the 28th of December, Hitler had written off 6th Army. Henceforth, it would be encouraged to keep fighting to tie Soviet troops down. 7 armies surrounded Paulus. If they were freed at a time when the Germans were already in trouble, it would do even more damage. So, from a strategic point of view, it does make sense to have the 6th Army hold on at Stalingrad, even though it meant that the men would be condemned to suffer and starve. Had they surrendered now, it's likely many of them would have seen Germany again after the war, something we'll talk about in the future. The fighting continued throughout the next day, and in the late evening of the 29th of December, Kotelnikovo fell to 7th Tank Corps and the supporting units. The 2nd Guards Army had also fully secured the bridgehead over the Don, and had moved 3rd Guards Cavalry and 2nd Guards Mechanized Corps over the river in preparation for the next day's operations. Also on this day, Wooster, the artilleryman who had been on leave since the middle of September, flew back to the Stalingrad pocket after insisting that he return to his unit through some sense of duty. But he soon regretted it after stepping off the plane and seeing all the wounded lying at the airfield, without a medic in sight. He described the scene as chaos, and couldn't believe that the Wehrmacht had been reduced to this. As the men at the airfield told him, there was no going back now. He had bought a one-way ticket to hell. On the 30th then, Group Kriesia advanced eastwards against Intervention Group Bassonia, a small and hopeless force that had no chance of stopping them. 11th Panzer Division raced up from the west to try and plug the gap, and in the south, the Soviets also advanced even further. Paulus therefore told his officers, "The army, without becoming alarmed, must be prepared for the fact it must hold the fortress for the next several weeks. The breakout has been temporarily postponed." He encouraged his men to prepare fallback positions and train rear services men to be infantry, placing General Lackmann of the 14th Panzer Division in charge of this process. Such was the desperation that he had no choice but to start pulling away forces allocated to the breakout. Over the next few days, the 29th Motorised Division would take up positions on the western line in the area of the 376th Infantry Division, as von Daniel's division was so weak at this point that it was down to just one regiment, the 767th. This move wasn't fully completed until the 5th of January, but we may as well show it now, and it should be obvious that while this did show up the western front, it came at the cost of weakening the southern sector, and perhaps more importantly confirms that Operation Thunderclap, the breakout operation, was officially no more. By New Year's Eve, it was clear that the airlift wasn't getting better. The statistics are up for debate, but the Luftwaffe was delivering an average of about 118 tons, or maybe 129 tons per day in late December, which was simply not enough. Doing some research elsewhere, it turns out that the 6th Army was requesting a minimum of 300 to 550 tons of supplies per day, even though an average German division consumed 200 tons per day. Now that figure for 200 tons comes from 1944, but even if it's a ballpark figure, a fully supplied German division consumed 200 tons, whereas the entire 6th Army, with over 20 admittedly depleted divisions, was actually expected to live on 300 tons. And in reality they were receiving 118 or 129 tons per day on average. Not much more than half of what one division should have received. Also, each individual Allied division in Western Europe in 1944 required 650 to 700 tons per day. So, one Allied division in 1944 was expected to receive more supplies than all of the 6th Army in 1942. That should put things into perspective here. Worse, the 6th Army's senior quartermaster described the dubious contents of the airlift supplies, which included contraceptives, sweets, herbs and peppers, plus propaganda pamphlets. Toilet paper was also delivered. Hundreds of medals for the Croatians were supplied in boxes so large that Colonel Adam was appalled. 2 tons of mail was sent to the pocket per day, which was good for morale, but again, surely the priority was the food and ammunition. Far more food was being shipped in than before, but only at the cost of less fuel and ammunition, and even then it wasn't enough. The bread rations, which had already fallen to 80 grams per day, were now reduced to just 75 grams. This was effectively 2 slices of bread per soldier per day. Obviously this was complemented with horse meat and other supplies, but even factoring all that in, the average soldier was still consuming less than 1,000 calories per day. Some primary sources suggest that the combat troops received higher amounts than those behind the lines, so maybe it wasn't too dire for them. By early January, Paulus's army was clearly on the path to starvation. If it was any consolation, across the front, Chirikov reported to his superiors on 31st of December that his soldiers were surviving on a ration of 100 grams per day. Chirikov's report may not be accurate. Other evidence says that the footbridge and the freezing of the Volga had resulted in cases of American canned goods littering Soviet foxholes at Stalingrad by this point. so maybe Chuikov had delivered a false report in the hopes of receiving even more supplies. Either way, what wasn't a consolation to Paulus was that Meight's corps had now basically collapsed. They tried to retreat to previously prepared fallback positions, but Soviet cavalry beat them to them, and so Nizhny Cherskaya fell to the Soviets. The Germans hastily erected a new line on the Aksanets River, as Tomosin was also lost, effectively concluding a very successful operation by the Red Army. With the Tomosin offensive complete, and Kotelnikovo also in their hands, there was now no hope for a Stalingrad breakout or relief operation, and Paulus was effectively left to his fate. In little more than a week, the Red Army had achieved a stunning victory, cementing their dominance of the battlefield throughout the southern sector of the Eastern Front. And in just a few days' time, the final offensive against the 6th Army would begin. We'll see the start of that operation next time. Thanks for watching, bye for now.